First of all, well, I thought that was absolutely fascinating, and there are quite a few points there I think we may pick up. As Bronwyn also said, James Nixie and I have written a couple of comments. We've covered quite a few of the issues, and indeed, part of the reason we got together the Russia-Eurasia program, the Global Economy and Finance program, and the International Law program to do this event was because we'd had many debates. We hadn't really resolved them, but we felt that these were issues that really needed to be addressed. And I actually think James's article is brilliant. I don't agree with everything in it, but I think it's well worth reading. So I recommend that you do that. What we're going to do now is look at the theory and practice of repurposing sanctioned assets, and in particular look at legal, financial and political issues. And as I think is clear, we want to focus on the question of state assets, and in particular 300 billion of Russian state assets that's currently in play, if you like. There are another 58 billion of private sector assets. That's a smaller number. That's partly why we didn't look there. The issues are somewhat different. But today's focus is very much on the state assets. We'll see about this. My sense is that the issues are legal issues, financial issues are actually more acute in relation to state assets. And to address these questions, we've got, as I say, a really brilliant panel. Next to me is Alison MacDonald, KC, who's a barrister at the Essex Court Chambers. Next to her is Tim Sargent, Canada's former Associate Deputy Minister of Finance and Deputy Minister of International Trade. Next to him is Tom Keating. And now, Tom, you better tell me what your centre is now called, because I think have I got it right? No, I've got it wrong. The new name is Centre for
Finance and Security.
Brilliant, Tom. Thank you. At the Royal United Services Institute. And then online, we have Philip Zelikow, Senior Fellow at Stanford University Hoover Institution. And Philip, thank you so much for being here, because I know it's a super early hour of the morning. So we really appreciate you making the effort to be with us. And as you may have, in the session that just came before you with the Deputy Minister of Finance, she was very much referring to the advice that she had received from you, and in particular the legal advice, and those are issues that we will get into during today's discussion. So Alison, perhaps I could kick off with you. There is a lot of debate around the legal issues. I think some people see it as relatively straightforward, others not so. Could you sort of just set out what you see as the main legal issues that need to be addressed? That would be a great way to start.
Yeah,
thank you.
Obviously, there are lots of different perspectives from which we can consider what should be done in this situation. Obviously, moral and political considerations play a large part, and we've just heard those extremely powerfully put. As you say, I'm going to kick off the discussion from the lawyer's perspective, and that's to say, what is the legal debate about repurposing? Where do the challenges lie? And what are people thinking about them? What are some ways forward? We all know the question of repurposing assets, that is bringing about a permanent change in ownership, so it's the step beyond freezing, is a complicated one. So to start with a word of humility on my part, this is an unprecedented situation in many ways. Many lawyers all around the world are studying the issue, in governments, in academia, in private practice, and in institutions such as the EU, the Council of Europe. And I think the key thing here is that there's a wide range of states who support Ukraine firmly and are really keen to find a legally robust way of bringing about the repurposing of the assets. So there's a huge will to do so. What are the legal questions that we face? So obviously, I'll take as read the fundamental legal starting points here, that Russia's use of force amounts to aggression. The UN General Assembly has repeatedly affirmed that. And they've also affirmed that that gives rise to a legal obligation on Russia to make full reparation for all the consequences of its unlawful acts. And that's not legally controversial in the least, but it is legally a very important starting point. And we heard Krista Freeland just emphasize that a moment ago as well. So when we think about assets, getting assets to Ukraine, I think the first thing to do is to think about what legally relevant categories of assets we're talking about here, because there are a few different pots, different types of money that we hear in the conversation. So I think it's important to start with that. There's state assets versus assets owned by private individuals. Within state assets, there's assets which the state are using for commercial purposes. And against that, there's assets that are the state's using for sovereign purposes. Classic example being the central bank of Russia. Then there's the question of principal sums. So, as it were, to put it simplistically, the money that was there at the moment of freezing versus interest that may accrue or other forms of increase of the assets that may come about post-freezing. So there's the original money and then there's additional amounts. And that distinction is one that may, I think, come up in the conversation that we're going to have as well. So if we say that financially speaking, just in terms of sheer amount, the state sovereign assets are the most significant, then in brief outline, the legal issues that we need to look at are, firstly, immunity. That's the key thing. Does the doctrine of immunity apply as a starting point if the repurposing is through executive or legislative action rather than involving the courts in any way? So there's an interesting question about whether immunity is triggered at all by executive action versus legislative, versus judicial decisions. Secondly, if immunity does attach to these assets, so they could, in principle, benefit from this, could any breach of international law that would be involved in repurposing be justified as a countermeasure in international law? And the doctrine of countermeasures probably one that we've seen coming up most frequently recently. So a countermeasure, if it's lawful and it fulfills the criteria, which I'll say in a moment, that makes an act that would otherwise be unlawful, justifies it in international law. So there's no international law illegality where you take a lawful countermeasure. Alternatively, might customary international law evolve so as to permit repurposing in specific cases? How would you define those cases? And finally, could assets be repurposed to satisfy judgments of international courts and tribunals? For example, any damages awarded down the line by the European Court of Human Rights or potentially the International Court of Justice. I think that's probably a whistle-stop tour for now, but we can certainly dig down into, for example, what countermeasures involve.
Well, maybe actually before we're moving on the countermeasures point, because I mean this is a crucial aspect. I mean, how do you see both the concerns about whether this is a sufficiently strong basis versus the argument in favour of relying on that aspect of international law?
Well, interestingly, the first, I think, sensitivity for states in openly relying on the doctrine of countermeasures is that you only need the doctrine when you're doing an action that would otherwise be unlawful. So it does involve states in coming clean and saying, we're doing something that would in theory be unlawful, but we're justifying it with this doctrine. So that's something which it's a sensitivity in invoking that doctrine. And that's why there are lots of things that states do that actually you would have to, when you analyse them, think they were countermeasures, but they don't necessarily like to shout it from the rooftops. When you look at what you need for a lawful countermeasure, you've got to establish, firstly, that third states who are not directly involved are legally entitled to take countermeasures to help another state. To me, I think that's fairly clear. The aim of the countermeasure has got to be to induce the wrongdoer state to comply with their legal obligations. And again, that's clearly the objective here. The countermeasure must be temporary and it must be reversible in the sense that it could be reversed if the wrongdoing state complied with its obligations, and it must be proportionate to the wrong that's addressed. And the reversibility is obviously a question here because there's an analysis which I think is overly superficial, which is to say, well, once you've taken an asset, you've given it to Ukraine, that's not reversible because you're not going to ask Ukraine to give it back. Now, that said, I think the answer to that is to be very clear about what obligation by Russia we are saying that the countermeasure is supposed to induce compliance with. Now, of course, there's the primary obligation, as you put it in international law, which is to cease the invasion of Ukraine, to end the unlawful use of force. But there's the consequent obligation, which is to make full reparation for the consequences of all wrongful acts. So I think you can say, unless and until, from a legal perspective, Russia makes full reparation for every bit of damage it has done financially, then it has and not complied with its obligations. Should it pay Ukraine in full for everything it's done, reversibility would mean, Ukraine wouldn't seek double recovery. In one form or another, the assets taken would be offset against Russia's bill. So I think reversibility isn't conceptually so much of a problem here as it might seem at first.
Yeah. Alison, thank you very much. Maybe, Tim, I can move to you next. I mean, I know that, the issues that Alison has described are precisely the ones you spent a lot of time thinking about, but you've also got a broader framework for the way we should approach this question, and indeed a specific solution. But maybe I could ask you first about that broader framework. How should we put these legal issues alongside all the other issues that we need to take into account?
Sure, and I should say I come at this as an economist, and so economists have a tendency to want to push aside irksome legal and political problems and kind of focus on the fundamental economic problem. But unfortunately, almost 30 years in government have told me that those legal and political problems are often the most complicated ones, and they're often the most crucial. So what are we trying to do here? I mean, we're trying to find a way to allow a country that's been attacked by another country in clear violation of international law, and has clear claim to the eventual reparations, to access those sanctioned assets now. And this may certainly appear to be a moral imperative, especially to the aggrieved country, but also to those who support it. But it's obviously not straightforward to engineer, and there are a lot of practical problems that have to be addressed. And I kind of divide this into 5 kind of buckets. Firstly, there are the legal problems that Alison spoke about. I mean, how do you need to establish a credible claim to the assets in a way that passes legal muster, both in domestic and international law, and deals with the issue of state immunity. There's also a spatial problem. The assets of the aggressor are not usually in the aggrieved country. If, the Ukraine example, if there were a lot of Russian assets in Ukraine, I don't think we'd all be here. I think the Ukrainians would have dealt with that. There's also this economic problem, a temporal problem. Usually talking about an aggrieved country that needs the resources immediately, needs the resources to repair damage that's already been incurred and to fight the war. And you can't say, well, this money is going to come to you eventually. All you need to do is go out on international capital markets and borrow money against the day when you have victory and reparations are paid. Leaving aside all the other issues, the country is likely to have very limited ability to borrow. Countries fighting wars usually max out their borrowing capacity fairly quickly. Fourth set of problems are reputational problems. For those countries that are holding the assets are going to be very rightly worried about the precedent that they set and what other countries, other sovereigns in this case, who want to place money in various international clearing centers, what they are going to think about this. And then there's finally what I call a collateral damage problem, which is you do have to be very conscious about the potential retaliation by the aggressor that may itself be freezing assets, holding assets, both sovereign and non-sovereign assets in the country of the aggressor. So if we look at the various proposals that are on the table right now and just look at the kind of the broad spectrum, I mean, at one end, I'm tempted to call it kind of more timid end, but certainly the more restrained end is the EU has certainly signed up to a mechanism for confiscating the interest from the sanctioned assets as it accumulates. So in a given year, that interest is used to purchase various aid. I mean, the problem with that is, we're not talking about a lot of money here, and that doesn't bring forward anything like doesn't bring out anything like the amounts the aggrieved country requires. And that's particularly true in terms of sovereign assets that are generally invested very conservatively. And so the return that you're getting from these assets, the size of the assets is going to be a very big number, but the actual annual return is not going to necessarily be very high. There's a US proposal on the table that would essentially say, okay, instead of using the interest payments from this year, we're going to look ahead for 10 years in the case of this proposal. We're going to say, okay, that's the amount of money that the aggrieved party will receive, and we're going to go to financial markets and we're going to front load that money. We're going to bring forward that stream of assets using financial markets, which is perfectly, technically is perfectly feasible. The problem is, we don't know that in this particular case the war is going to last 10 years. What if hostilities cease very quickly, the aggrieved party wants their assets back, what happens to that stream of payments? At the other end of the spectrum, you have much more ambitious approaches. We have Canada's 2022 legislation that was spoke about. This does allow for outright confiscation and repurposing of assets. But it only applies, as was mentioned, to private parties. It's basically aimed at oligarchs. It requires judicial action, and so it brings in, if it were to be used against state assets, it brings on all of these issues of state immunity, etc. Of course, you can alter your legislation, perhaps. I mean, the recently passed US Repo Act largely exempts sovereign asset seizure from judicial review. Now, whether that can be transferred to other legal systems is an interesting question. Even in the US, it's not immune from constitutional challenge. You run into reputational problems, the collateral damage problems that I talked about. And I think for some of those reasons, it's not obvious that the US will go forward unilaterally.
Thanks very much. Tim, I mean, I think in a way that's a great framework to work with, and we might actually come back in the next round to talk about the specific proposal that you and colleagues have put forward. But as a former finance minister, I also want to ask you about the thing that really bothers me a lot, which is what is going to be the impact on global financial markets of a step of this kind. Now, there are $12 trillion of foreign exchange reserves out there. 300 billion is like 2.5%. It was fascinating what the Deputy Prime Minister said. She said, well, no one should really worry about this if they're another country, because they're not going to do unless they're going to do the kinds of things that Russia has done. Well, I'm actually not sure that is necessarily the case. You might worry about it. It might not be as simple if you are China or Saudi Arabia or India or whatever. So what is your answer to the financial risk question? And perhaps you could look at it in two ways. So one possibility is there's no big shock. It's just a few basis points on developed country debt. Developed country debt, 60 trillion of developed. And that could add up to an awful lot of money, especially if this is an indefinite premium that we pay. A lot more money than we might save from paying for our support for Ukraine in this way versus another way, through general revenue. The other argument is actually we're in a really difficult period in terms of geopolitical risk, all kinds of other things that are going on in terms of the impact of tensions between China and Russia on capital flows and so on. And if you add this on top, there is a risk you could trigger something really very unpleasant, which again would have major, not just financial, but economic cost. So what would be your answer to that? Why should we not worry about those scenarios?
Well, I mean, when I was a senior official at the finance department, so the Canada's equivalent of the Treasury, I mean, it was my job to worry so the politicians didn't have to worry so much, right? And there are always, one should always take, very seriously the law of unintended consequences. I think in this case, I think it's important to separate the nature of the assets from where they're being held. And those are two very different things. I do suspect that some of the large sovereigns that could really roil the bond market if they were to suddenly sell all of their US T-bills, let's say, even for a market as large as that. I suspect those sovereigns that might worry that they at some point might be on the receiving end of future G7 moves. I suspect that they're already taking action to ensure that their central bank assets are not being held by entities like Euroclear that are easy for Western countries to get to. Even leaving aside confiscation, just having your assets frozen is a real problem for a country. The whole point of these assets is that you can access them quickly, is that they're very, very liquid. And when you're going to need to access them is probably when you've done something to annoy the G7. So I suspect that process is already underway. I think the other question is, what if you were to go even further than just freezing assets or going after assets that are held in a clearance house? I mean, the US, in theory, could refuse to pay interest on bonds held by certain governments, wherever those assets are held in the world. I just can't see that happening. I mean, I think the reputational hit to the US in this case would just be enormous. I don't think we're seeing that. And I guess the final point I would make is that, I mean, sovereigns hold Western assets for a reason. Not because they love the US or Japan or the UK, but these assets are US T-bills. They're extremely safe, they're easily convertible, and they're denominated in the main currencies that are used in world trade. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Tim, thank you very much. Tom, I think as we were talking about earlier, an awful lot of this is political. You could argue it's all political one way or another. And indeed, the Deputy Prime Minister's initial kind of comments, highlighted the political nature of many of these judgments. So maybe you could just say a little bit about how you see the politics of this, the real-world politics of making this step. Perhaps you could highlight some of those issues.
Sure, it's not really fair because you asked a barrister a legal question, you asked an economist, and then you've asked an ex-investment banker a political question.
Well, you can answer the
absolutely. Don't you worry. I'm absolutely going to answer it. But I did just want to, if I might, I'll just start with a small story which picks up on something that Tim said. So in my last year at JP Morgan, I was charged with a mission, which was to persuade our central bank clients that they might want to sell some of their euros or their dollars and buy offshore Chinese RMB assets. Now, this was not an easy job, and it comes back to your point about the importance of liquidity and currency controls and all sorts of stuff. And I can report that at the end of one year of massive effort by me and my colleagues, we had managed to persuade central banks, and we were trying to get them to buy AAA assets issued by supranationals denominated in RMB. We had successfully got them to sell euros and dollars. Well done us. They had bought more Swedish krona in this process than they had Chinese RMB. And to me, admittedly, this was some years ago, but to me, that there was a lesson in that, which I think is worth remembering today, which is that, on the one hand, yes, you might be concerned that the G7 might come after your central bank assets. Okay, that red line has been crossed. But there are reasons that people hold euros and dollars. So I do think that's kind of important to emphasize. I also agree that, in my view, the point of maximum jeopardy was when those assets were immobilized, because I, for one, did not necessarily expect that to happen. That seemed like a bazooka move very early on in this process. And you tell me, we were kind of dealing with the fallout of Liz Truss, I suppose. But the bottom line is, the markets, I don't think, were roiled by that moment occurring. In the way that you might have expected.
But what about the point that doing this extra step could add a few extra basis points on a vast amount of public debt, which really would cost us all? We might as well pay for them.
So now to the political point. As we heard from the Deputy Prime Minister, and as we would say in the UK, as I'm sure they would say in Brussels, and they would say in Washington, we support Ukraine. Full stop, we support Ukraine. So the question is, if we support Ukraine, then we should be doing everything we possibly can. Another anecdote from JP Morgan. We were all once given this book called Getting to Yes, right? And we should be doing everything we possibly can to get to yes. Now, I accept that we need to go around the houses, and we need to check the laws, and we need to think about this, we need to think about that. But at some point, we need to get to yes on this. And whether it's through a financial engineering solution, whether it's through something more aggressive. And we started to get in that direction. And I do think that the G7 Leaders Summit has to be the point at which we get to yes. And I think that leaders who are going to be gathering there need to essentially be saying, how do we make a positive statement about this, the other side of that Leaders Summit? Not how do we say something which essentially means we're sucking our teeth again. And so I think a lot of people have done lots of legal analysis and lots of thinking of this, and there is a way through this. And I think we have to, what we need now is the political leadership that says we are going to get to yes. So we've seen movement in the US, and of course it's easy for the US, it's easy for Canada, it's easy for Lord Cameron, David Cameron here in the UK to be positive about this. But of course, the assets are in Belgium. The assets are in Europe. And the person that needs to get to yes ASAP is Christine Lagarde. I think we need some positive noises from Christine Lagarde on all of this, and she needs to find a way of persuading herself that we're not going to be undermining trust in the euro. Now, I accept, as someone who lived through it, who bailed out countries and banks that during the eurozone crisis, that there is a certain amount of PTSD in the eurozone on all of this. But I also think that we have the tools and mechanisms for dealing with volatility, were that to occur. And we need to fundamentally recognize that we are at economic war with Russia here. And so we need to take the measures necessary to help Ukraine not get their reparations in 10 years' time, but to actually have the funds they need today to win the war. And I don't think we would forgive ourselves if we said, well, we stood by international law, we did all the right things, but Ukraine's been wiped from the map. And I really, I do feel, were I a politician, that is the message I would be delivering. Creon.
Tom, thank you very much. We might come back to one or two of those points, but I'd like to now move to Philip. So you've heard, Philip, kind of legal, financial, political perspectives. I mean, first, it would be good to get your take on what you've heard, whether there's things you would agree with or things you would disagree with. But I'd also actually like to take Tom's point and put to you, you've managed to convince the Canadian Deputy Prime Minister this is a good way to go. Now your challenge is to convince Christine Lagarde. So what is the points that you would make to Christine Lagarde in the space that she operates? So in a central bank, technical, financial market, rather than the sort of broader political space, to try and get her over the line as well. But Philip, over to you.
Oh, well, Lagarde is looking for her cue from Bruno Le Maire and Olaf Scholz. Let me just be very straight about that.
Then what is the argument you make to them, I guess?
Yes. Well, it is worth, by the way, I thought the comments of the panelists were very good. It is worth stepping back where we are this morning. This morning, the United States government announced that Russia was using poison gas on the battlefield in Ukraine, chloropycrin, in violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. That's a remarkable step. We've had reports, by the way, of Russian use of poison gas on the battlefield for a couple of years now. And at last, we've decided now to publicly confirm that indeed that's true. So that's this morning. This morning also, the United States announced a whole series of sanctions on Chinese enterprises. Why? Because China, more than a year ago, embarked on a systematic campaign to build up the Russian defense industrial base on a massive scale. The United States and its allies have recently obtained information that portrays the full dimensions of this program. That program, by the way, has been quite successful. So here's China, Iran, North Korea, massively building up the Russian defense industrial base, the base of a country which is now using poison gas on the battlefield in Ukraine, compounding everything else. And here we are having this conversation at Chatham House. Just worth thinking about that for a second. I want to come back to, I'm happy to really go as deep as you possibly could want on any of the technical, legal, or policy issues on which I've spent, and I'm spending a lot of time, mostly working with several relevant governments. But it is worth stepping back and noticing at the position of principle that there are only two possible outlets for this $300 billion. This $300 billion can either go back to Russia or it can go to Russia's victims. Russia or Russia's victims are the only lawful beneficiaries of this money. So, is there any plausible scenario in which this money goes back to Russia? I don't see it. There were people who in the first year of the war, there were people who indulged the hope that the money could be a bargaining chip in the negotiations. But anyone who's actually practically involved right now in the diplomacy understands that that scenario does not exist right now in this war, and probably will not exist at least for the next year or two. As, by the way, Russia waits to see whether or not Ukraine has financial collapse. And incidentally, since the G7 have now taken the position over and over that Russia gets back zero money until Ukraine has been fully compensated, and since the amount of that compensation outstrips the assets, I can't work out a plausible scenario in which this money goes back to Russia. So the only other lawful beneficiary are the victims. But right now, the money doesn't go back to Russia. It doesn't go to the victims. It sits idle doing nothing while Ukraine is dying. So I want to stress a little bit the urgency of this, because it was very comfortable for people in Europe to think last month, oh darn, Trump and the conservative Republicans may be the cause of Ukraine losing the war. Well, good news. If Ukraine loses the war, it probably won't be the fault of Trump and the conservative Republicans. Good news, bad news is if Ukraine loses the war, it's more likely to be the fault of Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron, because they would not give Ukraine the evident war chest and staying power to win a war of attrition. And we will see that result, by the way. That result will become apparent by the end of this year. Why? If you examine the budget gap and demands for urgent recovery costs that require external financial support, including the current aid package, Ukraine, by various estimates, including the World Bank, probably needs something like $70 to $90 billion of external support during the next 2 years. We can then debate, where we are on that range and how we get to those numbers. 5 to 15 billion for the remainder of this year by various estimates, 25 to 35 billion next year. And I'm assuming, by the way, the existing EU commitment, IMF commitments. By the way, the whole IMF program for Ukraine is going to expire around the end of this year, beginning of next year. And unless there's an evident commitment to close its budget gaps, the IMF can't renew its program. So you've got this enormous scale, and then you have these ideas about interest and so on. So we have the money can't go back to Russia, and we're in a posture here where the money isn't going to go to the victims until, who knows, maybe years from now after they're dead. Not a good position. So, which actually was, I think, echoed in different ways by your panelists and by Axworthy and Freeland. So let's come back to the practicalities then of what to do. You've got to get stuff done. In my view, you have to get a durable solution for this in place before the American presidential election. Do I need to explain that any further? I hope not. So it would be nice, actually, if the durable solutions outlines were in place before Hungary took over the EU presidency. Do I have to explain that any further? I hope not. That gives us, folks, about 6 or 7 weeks. We are not right now on track to get this done in the next 6 or 7 weeks. I'll just tell you, we are not. We have an American proposal which devised in good faith and with earnest ability to develop basically a grant that would go to help the victims, above all Ukraine, on a massive scale by using the net present value of, let's say, 10 years worth of interest earnings, and stay inside the red line, stay inside the box that the French and Germans have set for us. Now, it does require, as I think Mr. Fraser points out, that we have to lock down the assets for 10 years to guarantee the source of repayment to whichever. And by the way, I think it'll be a government that will front this money. We're not going to kind of look for the private market to do this. And there are some practical problems with all of this. It turns out, when you sweat the details of this idea, which, by the way, is a good one-shot emergency idea, and it's the current plan A of the people who support action in the G7. It turns out that since you have to lock down the money for this long, you're taking steps that are very close to actually going ahead with Plan B and just transferring the assets anyway, because you're going to have to put them under a durable asset management scheme and the proponents actually kind of understand this, but they're trying to stay inside the box that the French and Germans have set for them and develop their Plan A inside that. And right now, the proponents are kind of inside the box. They may conclude that actually it's best to go ahead with the Plan B and transfer the assets, or at least put in motion the planning to do that, which, by the way, in my view, requires redepositing sanctioned assets into an international trust fund that can then disperse it both for urgent programs of recovery and reconstruction and budget support, and also set aside a portion of the assets for a very elaborate and time-consuming set of claims processes. By the way, which might involve non-Ukrainians, because the Russian wrongful behavior has damaged quite a few non-Ukrainians. I think you need to cap that liability, but I think that's something else you could do. I think ideally we should have the planning to get that in motion done and agreed to in the next 2 months. We are not currently on track to get there. And that's why I was really calling out above all the political accountability of the leaders of France and Germany, to whom, to return to your opening question, Christine Lagarde is highly attentive.
Philip, thank you. Can I just come back to you on the, how do you, when you look at the position France and Germany are taking as you interpret it, where do you think they're wrong in terms of their approach? I mean, if we put to one side the question of whether we should support Ukraine, I think we all agree we should support Ukraine. In a sense, the choice is between normal budget expenditure or using this as a route, and you've highlighted the uncertainties about a US election and so on. But when you try and interpret what France and Germany are saying at the moment, how do you interpret it, and where do you think they're wrong?
Well, let me be very direct. The number one concern they have is they're being blackmailed, and they don't talk about this publicly. Bob Zoellick alluded to this in his essay in the Wall Street Journal last week, because we have direct information about this. The Russians are very concerned that Ukraine not get this money. They understand how important this is. They have enlisted their people who support them to make threats. And they, of course, have made a series of threats. The Chinese and the Saudis have both gone in, say to the French, for example, and threatened them quite bluntly that we'll not buy your sovereigns. Will not buy your bonds if you go along with this plan. Now, there are ways to respond to that blackmail, and there are things that the United States government and various European foreign exchange holders, including, by the way, Poland and the Nordics, who are very large FX holders, can do actually to help the French manage that blackmail. But that's a big thing that's going on right now that they don't talk about.
Right.
And the Germans are being blackmailed by Russian threats that they're going to liquidate their companies. And the Russians have ostentatiously killed a few of their companies to show that they're ready to kill the hostages. Including, they've killed Carlsberg and Danone. They've liquidated their interests in order to show that they're prepared to do the others. That's a significant thing for the Germans. That's also a significant issue for the Japanese, which they also don't talk about publicly, is the Japanese are very nervous about LNG investments in Siberia and LNG supplies. So there are ways that governments can address that. Now, Schultz, in the German case, there's also some hand-wringing about setting precedents for reparations claims. I think people who want to find a reason not to do this can grab onto that because it sounds facile and persuasive. It doesn't hold up very well. There are a variety of things that can be done to assuage German concerns about the claims.
Okay, thank you.
And then there are also, there's the simple point, which is that they're going to face those problems anyway, and they already are, whatever happens on Ukraine. So they might as well go ahead and help Ukraine.
Philip, thank you very much. So what we're going to do is try and gather some questions from the audience. We have half an hour or so to gather your questions. What I'd like to do is take 2 or 3 questions at a time and a spread across the room. So I can see one, I think, gentleman is it gentleman or lady right at the back? Sorry, my glasses aren't great. If you could just ask your question and then we'll gather some others as well.
Martin Sandby from the Financial Times. Thanks, everyone. Very good discussion. I mean, I'd like to ask a question to those on the panel who think they have a feel for what's going on in Canadian politics. I'd like to ask the question that I wish Bronwyn had asked Minister Freeland, which is, despite Canada having taken a lead in terms of legislation, they've fallen short in two ways. So one is they have not tried to employ this legislation in any way to actually make a move on the assets. Why not? Secondly, they have not tried to take a lead in creating transparency on the nature and location and holders, institutional holders of the assets in Canadian jurisdiction over time, which they could have done. Why not? Both of those are instances of the question, why doesn't Canada, which has claimed to be a leader on this, actually try to properly move in front of the others? There was nice talk about Western unity, but that, of course, currently means moving at the speed of the slowest member. So I'd really like to try to understand from those who have talked to insiders in Canada, why not do a bit more and actually try to show how it's done? Thank you.
Great. Martin, thanks very much. Let's get another question from the lady here in the front, please.
Thank you very much. Tatiana Nestachuk, I'm a barrister at Fountain Court Chambers. My question really is about Philip's mention of various Western countries that are currently still based in Russia 2 years after the war started and 10 years after the invasion of Crimea and Donbass. And the concern by Germany, but I think by others as well, that those assets will be confiscated. I guess my question is to the experts on the panel is what can be done by our governments, Western governments, to persuade those companies to finally leave Russia, because they are currently paying a huge amount in taxes. The FT, Martin's colleagues, have done an investigation which highlights that about 1 billion is paid in tax by the banks alone, by European banks alone, not counting US banks. So what can be done by our governments to persuade those companies finally to leave Russia, especially the banks, because they are, of course, allowing Russia to circumvent the sanctions and giving access to SWIFT, for instance?
Great. Thank you very much. And let's take one more. And there's a lady straight over there. Let's ask her question as well. And then we'll come back for another round.
Hi, it's Stephanie Baker from Bloomberg. It's kind of pivoting off of Martin's question. Why hasn't there been more disclosure on where the assets are and how much? We know there's 190 billion at Euroclear, but the rest is still pretty murky.
Thanks very much. Okay. So Tim, how would you answer the question about Canadian politics? And we might actually ask Fen as well for his view on that as well. But Tim, do you want to have a go first?
Well, I don't want to get too close into Canadian politics. I mean, I haven't really been involved in the private side. It's more the state-sanctioned side, state-owned ads that I've been involved in. So I can't speak to exactly the whys and wherefores of the speed at which that has really been rolled out.
Yeah. Fen Hansen from WRMC, would you like to comment on that as well? Mike will come to you, I think, magically. Just, yeah, Jim.
I'm not a Canadian government official, so I can say whatever I want. The short answer is Canada actually has taken action. They went after assets held by Abramovich, some 25 million that he had in a Canadian company, seized them. There's an airliner. Any of you've flown into Pearson Airport, you'll see parked at the end of the runway. It's a Russian-owned airliner. We've seized that as well. And it's tied up in the courts because it's being challenged. But point of fact, Canada has taken action. When it comes to Russian state holdings, Russia very quickly moved assets that it had in Canada out of Canada because they saw the writing on the wall. And as Minister Freeland likes to say, there's $2.40 of Russian state assets being held in Canada. I'm not sure where that figure comes from, but in point of fact, and Philip can comment on this because I heard it from him, at a dinner in Washington. There is some 19 billion, I think you said, Philip, in Canadian bonds
that's
that
right.
are being held in Euronext
Oh,
accounts.
cash. Cash.
Yeah, cash.
Canadian cash.
Canadian
It's not being
cash,
held
even
in-
easier
It's not being held in Belgium.
in Euronext accounts and Euroclear accounts. And those monies do get cycled through North American financial institutions, including the Bank of Canada. And I'll turn to the experts to say, can you grab it when it's time to refinance them?
Yeah. Thank you. And maybe we could now come to, others who want to comment on Canadian politics are very welcome to do so, but maybe we could just come to the question here, which is really about Western assets that are still in Russia. And this is kind of important question in its own right, but it's also important because one of the issues that obviously people are concerned about, and Philip highlighted this, is potential retaliation against Western assets that are still in Russia. So maybe, is there, Alison, I don't know if you'd like to give a legal perspective on this to some extent. I mean, the question was partly around, I guess, how far can one encourage those investors to leave, I guess, as a way of, reducing the leverage that Russia has in this space. Are there any legal aspects to that? Also, to what extent would Russia, won't determine whether or not it does this, but if Russia were to retaliate against those assets, to what extent would it have a legal basis for doing so? Would be, along with everything else it's doing, outside international law?
Yeah, firstly on persuading companies to leave. I think that there's a very limited opportunity for one state to say to its domiciled companies, you can't go abroad to invest. You could do so legislatively, perhaps prospectively. I think telling them to pull initial existing investment out is probably legally difficult, but obviously the companies themselves have had quite a while to think about, the risks, the reputational issues. A lot of companies have pulled out of Russia, citing reputational concerns, citing concerns about financial risks. So a lot of companies have made their own judgment there. From an international law perspective, of course, the state is not entitled to take reprisals against nationals of particular states. It's not entitled to do that. There's likely to be also, depending on the nationalities of the companies in question, bilateral investment treaties by which Russia has committed not to expropriate the assets of investors of different nationalities. So there's likely to be multiple clear breaches of international law and Russia's treaty commitments in taking assets in that kind of vindictive tit-for-tat sort of blackmailing way that Philip described it. So yes, from a legal perspective, the answer is quite clear that that's not, it's not possible. Whether, of course, it would be done is another thing, because we're not dealing with a law-abiding actor.
Alison, thank you. And maybe, Tom, I could just ask you, because you
play the politician again.
Well, no, but you're also an expert in looking for money. So there was a question about, how come we only know where...
I used to have a spreadsheet on my desktop which had where all the Russian central bank assets are when I was the client relationship manager. So I don't really know why it's quite so difficult to find them. Frankly, sadly, that spreadsheet's 10 years old. Otherwise, I'd happily give it to you. But there's a point in here to the question over here. I think, again, I'm going to play the politician. We've spent the last 2 years, in some part, kind of pussyfooting around certain issues, and I think. And I fully respect the legal analysis and all the rest of it. But, the Kremlin is not entitled to do something. Well, you know what? It wasn't entitled to invade Ukraine. And that's what it's done. And I really like the phrase that Philip used, that, Russia is killing certain European companies. Well, it's killing Ukrainians. And I think we have to accept that there is going to be a cost of what is an economic war with Russia. Now, I have sympathy for companies that kind of feel that they're stuck in Russia, and we need to help them extricate themselves from that position. But I think we can't necessarily expect companies to make decisions without, at this point, coercing them. And I, again, accept that, you can't tell a company it can't go and invest somewhere. Well, you probably can, as you say, if you change the law. And what many of these companies say to us is, look, if you want our policy to change, then change the policy, right? And I think that's what, in a way, they're looking for. Because, again, I'm no lawyer, but I'm sure there's all sorts of contractual obligations and so on. And if they are coerced by their sort of home country to take certain measures, then that perhaps frees them up to do things that right now they feel uncomfortable doing. So I guess I would like to see an initiative from places like the UK to figure out how do we achieve that and meet the question that's been mentioned over there.
I think there's a question, isn't there, about how proactive governments are about disentangling their economies in both directions of financial flow from bad actors. So the US, I mean, Philip will know much more, but the US has been very active, for example, in trying to understand and disentangle itself from Chinese money, for example. So where there's a will to say, look, we don't want economic dependency. We do want to try to be clear about where our risks are.
And look, I mean, every government is now talking about an economic security strategy, right? It's something that people simply weren't talking about 5 years ago. Now they're talking about it. And yes, the United States has been very proactive in this. So if we kind of zoom out from the specific issue of Raiffeisen or Unicredit or whoever it is in Russia, what is our economic strategy as a kind of Western alliance in a world where we have fragmentation, and those that we thought were potentially friendable have turned out not to be?
Can I just add to
yes,
that?
I was going to come to you on that.
I mean, the reality is there's companies that made bets on Russia, and those bets are not working out very well for them. And those are decisions that they made. Like even before 2014, I think the character of the Putin regime was pretty well known. And so right now, the companies, if they want to make the bet that Russia is going to be significantly worried about the reputational effects of just outright confiscating private sector assets or otherwise making life unbearable for these countries, and they're willing to wait it out, then that's a bet that they can make as private sector companies. But I don't think as governments we should be being held hostage to these assets. And the reality is these assets are already zombie assets in many ways. I mean, they already they should be marked down by companies. The reality that you're going to get much out of Russia from these assets, I don't see that happening. But again, if companies want to take a different bet, they can.
Can I just have one very
Priyan, could I?
Yeah, well, just Tom's point, and then I was going to come to you. Yeah, so very super quick.
Certainly, I increasingly hear from kind of former colleagues of mine that specifically Raiffeisen and Unicredit are becoming dangerous to deal with, because you simply don't know when US Treasury will turn up and say, hang on a minute, why are you continuing to provide respondent banking services or whatever it might be? So they may well find themselves being forced into that decision.
Philip, actually, now to you both on both these questions, the European companies in Russia, but also this question of where the money is. But you may have other points as well.
Raiffeisen is actually already on notice, shall we say. The situation in Austria is very bad. I don't think I need to go into details. Let me focus, because it's very important for the audience to get up to speed, though Martin Sandbu already knows this, on the issue of where is the money. Because I've heard people, including here at Chatham House today, say that very little of it is, that it's all in Europe. Well, actually, it's not all. Take Euroclear, for example. Nearly 37%, it's nearly 40% of the Russian sovereign assets frozen at Euroclear, 37% are being managed in Canada, Britain, and the United States. They're being that's a sum that just Euroclear, that's a sum in the neighborhood of, say, $75 billion worth of assets are today being managed inside Britain, the United States, and Canada. Because Euroclear cannot manage Canadian dollars, US dollars, and sterling except through correspondent banks that do the management of the assets for them in those countries. That's the way the system works. Sometimes those assets may be commingled in cash management accounts, which, by the way, they should not be under Euroclear Bank's own internal rules. because under Euroclear Bank's own internal rules, it's know your customer rules, which, as everyone who went through the Obama years will remember, international banks got a severe lesson in U.S. jurisdiction over offshore accounts. And by the way, the British and the Canadians have moved on offshore accounts mainly against tax cheats. So there are precedents here in all those countries. And they should note that they are not allowed, they need to identify and segregate sanctioned assets and get those and not commingle them with non-sanctioned assets in their balance sheets. But 100% of the cash management of that 75 billion is being done inside Britain, Canada, and the United States. In the case of Canada, the total quantity of sanctioned assets that are in Canadian dollars just in Euroclear is about 19 billion. And as I say, all of that is being managed by Canadian partners.
Yeah. Philip, thank you. I'd like to get some more questions, but we can come back to these themes as well. So let's get some more questions. So there's a lady there on the far side. Sorry, gentleman right. Yep, gentleman right. If you, lady, sorry, ma'am, if you'd like to make your question, sorry.
Sorry. Mary Dojevsky, I'm a journalist. I write for The Independent and other people. This is going to be a really difficult question to ask, but I'd like to have a go at re-asking the question that you asked about how to persuade Christine Lagarde and whether France and Germany were not, in their own terms, maybe right. Because when we look across the people who are talking about confiscating assets, we're looking at people with very little to lose who can claim the moral high ground. And the people with a lot to lose are using, those people claiming the moral high ground are talking about, oh, we can change the law, or as Chrystia Friedland said, oh, people need to get their legal frameworks in place. Now, what about France and Germany and the Southern Europeans who, in living memory, know the cost of not having the rule of law, and so the value of that, and so their interests on the legal question and the financial question coincide in the same way as the interests and the values coincide on the other side?
Thank you very much. Very good question. Actually, before we come to the gentleman back there, there was a gentleman on the corner I'd like to.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Gimlet from Covington and Burling. Philip mentioned in his remarks that there's a current US proposal to collateralize the income stream from these assets and to pay that out as a loan to give Ukraine a certain amount of benefit up front. Of course, that benefit would fall far short of the benefit Ukraine would get from having the assets confiscated in full and handed over to a compensation fund. What risk is there that if there's agreement in June on a sort of halfway house of a collateralized loan, that will preclude the possibility further down the road of freeing up those assets and giving them in their entirety to Ukraine?
Thank you very much. Then there's a gentleman right at the back, I think.
Thank you. I just wanted to make...
Could you just say who you are, please? Thanks.
Yes, my name is Matthias Wirwol. I work for BlackRock, but I'm commenting in my personal capacity. I wanted to make one comment first, which is at the beginning of the conversation, it was said that the interest that comes from these assets is actually very small. As far as I know, that's around $3 to $5 billion a year. That would not be my definition of a small amount. I think it's quite meaningful. And if you look at the reconstruction needs estimated by the World Bank, which I think is $486 billion, over 10 years, and you put in perspective $5 billion, let's say, over 10 years, that's 50 billion. I would say that's not a small amount. I would keep that in mind. And the other thing, I don't think it was mentioned, but it's very important to understand that this interest does not belong to the Russians, it belongs to Euroclear. So we're not talking about expropriating this interest from the Russians. It's more about thinking of a windfall tax or something that would be levied on Euroclear. I think that's the discussion in Europe. And Philip, I know you're super in the details there. You please correct me if I'm saying something that's not correct.
Okay.
So with that in mind, my question would be to Philip, you said earlier that there are two options with these assets. One is to return them to Ukraine, to the Russians, and the other is to give them back, so one is to give them to the Russians, and the other is to give them to Ukrainians. But isn't there actually a third option, which is to not give them to anybody, leave them where they are, and use them as a kind of endowment that keeps paying $3 to $5 billion a year for whatever time, whoever has the decision authority over this would be required? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to one question here, and then we're going to try and get some super quick responses to see if we can fit in another. So there's a lady down on the side there. I'm sorry for the people with the mics you're having to run around, but I'm trying to get a good spread.
Thank you. Talita Diaz, I'm a senior research fellow here at Chatham House at the International Law Program. I have a legal question, probably for Alison, and it's about countermeasures. And I agree that countermeasures should be the focus of any legal discussion about repurposing sanctioned sovereign assets. And I also agree, Alison, with you that reversibility is not an obstacle here for the simple reason that reversibility only applies as far as possible. So it's not a stringent restriction. But I think that the elephant in the room, and you mentioned that very briefly, is sanctions, collective countermeasures. So countermeasures taken by states, third states, that are not injured directly by the Russian aggression in this case, right? And the biggest hurdle there is the lack of sufficient state practice and opinion juris. So there isn't, and many scholars have shown that many states outright reject that. And two of those states are precisely Canada and France, right? And so two questions for you on that. So what is your view on this very vexed question? And what advice would you give to all states that are trying to find a legal solution for this conundrum, especially on this issue of collective countermeasures? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what I'd like to do is to ask everybody to respond to their choice of those four questions. So we've got one about, France and Germany, aren't they right in some way? We've got two questions around the stream of income and how it's used, and then a question about countermeasures. So Alison, maybe if you'd like to kick off, particularly on the countermeasures.
Yes, I'm kicking off on countermeasures. Obviously, there is not a completely settled position on the existence of collective countermeasures. Some states, as you say, some states will very much say that there are such things. Some states reject. So there is a certain level of uncertainty in the state practice and the opinion juris. So in other words, what states think about whether something is legally the case or not. That said, I think that collective action in this instance is a perfectly tenable, and I think more than tenable view that they exist in international law, and a bunch of state practice occurring in a burst would really firm that up. So you can have a principle of international law crystallize pretty fast, where it's tenable, it's there, it's many states think it exists already, and you can have that firmed up pretty fast if states very clearly and explicitly act on that basis. So I think that you could crystallize as you go, in a way, which shows really the sort of dynamic nature of international law.
Thank you. Very good. Tim.
Yeah. So, I mean, $3 to $5 billion is actually quite small versus the scale of support that Ukraine has been receiving and needs. I mean, that's been in the 100 billion to 150 billion a year range, and that's just to keep Ukraine where it is right now. Like, if you wanted Ukraine to actually win this war, we're actually looking at more resources than that, to say nothing of reconstruction. The French and the Germans had to persuade them. I mean, at the end of the day, they're going to need some legal way to move forward on this, some way to justify this. But also, at the end of the day, France and Germany are a lot closer to Russia than Canada is, or the United States is. And my experience in these matters is generally form will ultimately follow function. But we have to be able to help the French and the Germans and the Ukrainians, the French and the Germans and others in the EU to find a way to be able to minimize the reputational hit, the precedent that's being set here, and that's the way forward. in terms of, is there a trade-off between those proposals that essentially scoop the interest going forward and those that actually go after the principal? I don't think that there has to be. At the end of the day, if you've already set up a mechanism that scoops the interest for a certain period, and then you actually go outright and seize the assets, you can obviously use some form of the asset seizure to pay off the bonds that you've already sold on the basis of that stream of interest flow. So I don't think that has to be an objection. Right.
Tom.
Very fulsome answers. As I was asked to play the politician, I will defend the Deputy Prime Minister. Russia has decimated the rule of law, and I think we are at a point now where, were I advising Macron or Schulz, I would say there are ways of doing this, and to a point I made earlier on, we now have to get to yes. And that, frankly, is what I would say in response to the point that was made over there. On the others, I will pass.
Super. And Philip, would you like to come back on those range of questions?
Yes, two things. First, the international law question was about third-party standing, and she was saying, well, Canada doesn't buy what's called erga omnes standing, which is what Ms. MacDonald was referring to. I agree with Ms. MacDonald, by the way, but here's the key point. The Canadian, British, and American governments have gone along with this position without agreeing to erga omnes standing. All three of those governments basically are running on specially affected standing. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check Article 41 of our CEWA. So there are two basic grounds of standing. One is generic third-party standing because the violation is so bad. That's the erga omnes argument. Another path to standing is to say we have standing to participate in countermeasures because we've been directly affected by the bad behavior. Well, the United States, Britain, and Canada have easy grounds to argue that they have been specially affected by the bad behavior on many reasons, as does everyone in Europe. So they're running on that ground of standing with specially affected and therefore not leaning on the customary international law point. The second thing is the BlackRock questioner about can't we just use this as an indefinite endowment? Well, in addition to Tim's point about sufficiency, and then you just have to make the numbers add up. And remember, in my intervention, I said something about what the immediate number requirements are. There are two things that are salient. One, many governments in the world think that the argument that the interest income belongs to Euroclear is unsustainable. I'll just tell you that argument is not sustainable in either Canadian or American jurisprudence. Now, I understand how the EU lawyers and the Belgian lawyers got themselves into that box, but it's probably a box that's hard to extend outside of Belgium. Let me just put it that way. And it's very hard to apply that to the management of other countries' assets. That's one problem with it. The other problem with it is this. If I'm going to use it as an endowment forever, that means I have to take control of the money forever so that I can put it in my endowment. Well, if I put it in my endowment so that I can use the money for the next 10, 20, 30 years, well, I've kind of sort of confiscated it, haven't I? So I think, in a way, in order to implement that suggestion fully, you might as well just do the right thing.
Philip, thanks very much. Now, thanks to our speedy responses, we've got 5 minutes for one and possibly two more questions, but they have to be short questions. So I'm looking around. Who would like to? I've got one gentleman there, and is there any other question? Because I have a question if you don't. There's a gentleman at the back. So let's take this question and then that one.
Thank you very much. I'm Michael O'Kane from Peters & Peters. Can I ask a question about sanctions and assets that have been frozen on behalf of individuals? The British government's current policy is that they want, and the legislation was changed in order to encourage donations to be made for the reconstruction of Ukraine. But they have disassociated that from delisting. In other words, if a sanctioned Western-orientated Russian business person wants to make a donation to Ukraine for the reconstruction of Ukraine, that will have nothing to do with their designation. I suspect that has been a policy which has raised zero in terms of money for Ukraine. Would the panel be in favor of tweaking that policy so there was a connection? One has to be sensitive, obviously, that they don't want to see rich people just getting off the list because they can pay money. But overwhelmingly, the foreign policy objective here has to be to help Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. A little bit outside our area, but we'll try and answer that one. And then the gentleman at the end. Yeah.
Hi, Max Colster from the Wall Street Journal. I had a question for the panel. Can you maybe just quantify how probable it is, given French and German skittishness about seizing these sovereign assets, that money belonging to the Russian state will be transferred to Ukraine within the next year? Thanks.
Thanks very much. Okay. I think. Okay, so Tom first.
Michael's one, and then I can do that one. A kite was flown last summer by the Foreign Office. My personal view is that, yes, the policy will indeed realise zero as it's currently constructed. Again, this isn't a discussion about oligarchs, but the freezing of oligarch assets, again, my personal view at the beginning of the war was something that could be done quickly. And for many politicians who were at the top of the house at that time, who aren't around anymore, it was in a way something that they'd been pressured to do for a very long time, and here was an opportunity to do it. Now, there are lots of maybe positive reasons that those assets were frozen. I would like to see a policy that was along the lines of, I think I've said this before, like, you know, defect, denounce, and donate, something like that, which actually realises assets for the benefit of the Ukrainian people. However distasteful that might sound, at the end of the day, what we are talking about here is money for the Ukrainian people. And I would like to see whoever came up with that idea in the Foreign Office, whoever minister it is, actually put some meat on the bones 1 year later.
Thank you very much. Great. So I think that's a very good, that's responding to that one. We got this good question of, where are we going to be at the end of the year? And maybe, Philip, I could ask you, do you think, there's the G7 summit, do you think we would have got money flowing to Ukraine from this source by the end of the year?
I don't know. That's why we're here, right?
Yeah, I know. But there's a sort of, it's a positive and a negative.
No.
Yeah.
I'm not going to, that's a sucker's game to play that handicap the horse race.
Okay.
That's not what I do for a living. I try to steer outcomes of horse races, not predict them.
Okay, fair enough. Does anybody else want to have a go at that? No. Okay, and I have one very last question. So in real politic world, we can see, for example, in the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict, we can see negotiations going on between parties that are, deeply at odds, where very bad things have been done to both sides. Now, you could say Russia-Ukraine is very different from that, but in a way, my instinct is essentially there are going to be negotiations at some stage to settle this conflict. And, my view would be that when those negotiations happen, one should have as much as possible in play to enable the negotiations to produce a good result from Ukraine's point of view. Now, to some extent, acting now on the sanctioned state assets takes something off the table. Now, I know there's an argument that actually all of this money has gone already, but just looking at it from a kind of diplomatic point of view, where you're going to have a negotiation at some point, and there's an issue about having in there as many things as possible, in a sense, to get the best possible outcome for Ukraine. Isn't that a counterpoint that actually we should hold this to use in the future? So maybe I could ask Tom and then get everybody else's. So it's a quick, 30-second answer.
Whenever I negotiate for anything, I try and do it from a position of strength, and we need to put Ukraine in a position of strength, and using these assets is the way of doing it.
Doing it now,
yes,
as opposed to having it in the future.
Yes, because a negotiation in 10 years' time might be with a forgotten country.
Or with a very different government.
Correct.
Okay. Tim?
I would agree with that. The reality is, the West is going to ultimately, pay for the war and for the reconstruction. We can take the $300 billion now, or wait for the eventual peace agreement. it's all, an ultimate peace agreement is going to depend on the various bargaining powers of the various parties at that time. Maybe we have to pay back the 300 billion because Russia's in a very strong position. Maybe we can, maybe we won't. But the reality is Ukraine needs help now, and as was said, the more resources that we can give Ukraine right now, the better that ultimate bargaining position, not just for Ukraine but for the West, is going to be. And that comes down to, are Western taxpayers going to continue to foot that bill, or are they going to start to object, in which case the attention will very much turn to these assets.
Great. Alison, can you see any legal reasons for waiting?
Well, no, I mean, the law, the legal position is as it is. So, I mean, one has to, acting within the legal framework, think, well, it's not changing. It's only developing as we do this. And if you think practically of relative bargaining position, to not have these assets means very little economically to Russia, really, in the scheme of things, weighed against what it means to Ukraine to have them, and to have them promptly. I mean, the time value of money is a phrase which I think applies incredibly here, and the law is not going anywhere.
Okay. Thank you. And Philip, last word from you.
Yes, Russia is right now looking to win the war. They're looking to score a knockout in the next year or two. And actually, Ukraine's financial insolvency is a key factor in Russia trying to win the war. So the issue of Russia has effectively written off these assets. They're not expecting to see them again, but they're desperately anxious that Ukraine not get them. And then there is this point, which actually Alison flagged in her opening comments. There is no scenario in which the money goes back to Russia and Ukraine is not compensated. The G7 leaders have now said this at least 3 times formally that I know of. And Alison said, well, then anything you give to Ukraine is credited as an offset against whatever liability Russia is ultimately found to have. So there. So even if you have a peace agreement, it's not like then you're going to claw back lawful compensation from people who are entitled to it. And that's already the G7 view.
Okay. Great. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for now. Please join me in thanking our panelists.